words that Nathan the prophet delivers to David crush him. They humble David, and they lead him to being honest for the first time in a long time about his sin. First and foremost, his sin against the Lord. And now, as we saw, Nathan responds to David's confession by saying, the Lord has put away your sin, David. You're not going to die, even though that is exactly what he deserves for what he's done. But at the same time, I don't want us to forget what Nathan says in 2 Samuel 12, verse 14. He says, nevertheless, David, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who's born to you shall die. The sword's never going to depart from David's house. The consequences of his sin are going to go with him throughout the rest of his life, and it's going to begin with the life of the boy that was just born to Bathsheba. That child is going to die, and Nathan leaves. And I don't know how you think David must have felt after this, but we look at 2 Samuel 12, verse 15. The Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David. Interesting, even how the storyteller, he doesn't use her name here, Bathsheba, just that Uriah's wife bore to David. The Lord afflicts the child becomes sick. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, fasted, went in and lay all night on the ground, seemingly in the room with his little boy that's being afflicted by the Lord because of his own sin, and he's pouring out his heart to God. The elders of his house stood beside him to raise him up from the ground, but David wouldn't get up. He wouldn't eat any food. And on the seventh day, the child died. The servants don't want to go in. They don't even want to talk to David. They think if David's been acting like this while the child was living, how's he going to act when he finds out that the child is dead? But David sees them thinking through this. He says, what happened? Is the child dead? And they tell David that his child is dead. He gets up, he washes, he anoints himself, changes his clothes, and he goes into the house of the Lord. This is in 2 Samuel 12:20, and he worshipped. His heart is being brought back. He's coming back to be the kind of man that he was before this horrible fall. And the servants, they don't get it. They're like, what are you doing? You know, while the child was living, you were so grieved you wouldn't even eat, and now the child is dead, and you're up and you're going around as normal. And David says, interestingly, in verse 22, says, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he's dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. David then goes to his wife, Bathsheba, comforts her, and they have a son. Another son. They call this one Solomon. And notice, 2 Samuel 12, verse 24, and the Lord loved him. So he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. God has graciously given David and Bathsheba another son, Solomon. And the Lord's attention and love is on that child, on that son of David. And we have to remember the promises that God has made to David are guaranteed that he's going to not take his love away from David and his family. And he's going to put David's son on the throne. The Lord has covenanted himself to do this. And now our attention is being drawn to David's son, Solomon, whom the Lord's special love is on. But the consequences of David's sin are far from over. You come into 2 Samuel chapter 13. Remember, the sword will never depart from your house. He's already experienced the death of one of his sons, that little baby. And now, 2 Samuel chapter 13, We find out that David, one of his sons, Absalom, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. But David has another son through another wife, a son named Amnon. And Amnon loves his half-sister Tamar. So much, in fact, that he's willing to do anything to try to get alone with her. And I won't go into all the details of this story, but he basically pretends to be sick. He says, "Oh, just send Tamar, my sister, in so she can care for me." And in a horrible, horrible story, Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. And we think that the promise to David of judgment in his life for what he had done is coming to pass. He hears about it, and it's interesting. It's so sad even how this is talked about, but the hatred then that Amnon has for Tamar, whom he has humiliated and violated and shamed, the text says that the hatred that he felt for her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. He didn't love her. He loved himself and used her and abused her. And David hears about it. And he's so angry, but he doesn't do anything to Amnon. But Absalom, the full brother of Tamar, hears what Amnon has done to his sister. And he doesn't say anything or do anything right away. But he hates his brother in his heart. And he begins to look for the right time to get revenge. Well, after 2 full years of waiting, Absalom finally gets his chance. Absalom and Amnon, the young man who had raped Tamar, Absalom is with Amnon. And Absalom takes Amnon and he murders him. The consequences of David's sins keep coming. This is now his second son who has been killed since his sins against Uriah, his sins with Bathsheba. Absalom then flees to try to get away because he knows they're going to be coming after him for what he's done to his brother, to Amnon. And he flees, and for a long time he's away. And David's heart is going out for his son Absalom. He's like he's already lost a third son, Absalom, whom he loves, who's taken vengeance into his own hands against Amnon. And David he wants him to come back, but he doesn't know what to do. And so Absalom's just away in exile. And you can just feel the weight on David of his sin and of the consequences that he is experiencing. And so finally, Joab, David's chief commander, remember, he tries to figure out a way to speak to David that's going to get him to bring Absalom back. I mean, after all, he knows his heart's going out for Absalom. Why isn't he bringing him back? And so Joab has an idea. He goes and he finds a woman from Tekoa, who's a very wise woman, and he tells her a story to tell David. And so this woman comes in, and we already heard David get a story, right? From Nathan, remember, about the sheep and the man who took the one sheep, and it didn't go well for David, that story. And now she's going to tell him another story. And so she comes, 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 4. The woman comes to David, and she falls on the ground before him and says, "Save me, O king." The king's like, "Well, what do you need?" And she tells this story. "Look, I'm a widow. My husband's dead. I had 2 sons. They were quarreling with one another. There was nobody there to stop them, and one of my sons killed my other son. And now the people of the town, they want to come and they want to kill my last son. I've got nobody left." The king says to the woman, "Just go home. I'll give orders concerning you. I'll make sure that your other son, the only one you have left, I'll make sure that no one lays a hand on him." And then the woman turns the story on David. And This is maybe, even if you're familiar with the Bible before this study, this is a story maybe you're not as familiar with. And there's a reason. I want you to see what the woman says to David. She turns the story on David. 2 Samuel 14, verse 12. Then the woman said, "Please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." He says, "Speak." And the woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again." See, David's probably like, "Don't tell me any more stories," right? After this, but he hears this and she says, "You aren't doing what you were willing to do for me. Your son is in exile for what he did for his brother, and you're not willing to look out for him and bring the banished home. Why aren't you willing to do it?" But she doesn't stop there. She says in verse 14, "We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast." You hear that? This is her perception of God. God is a God who devises means to bring the banished home. And then her challenge is to David, bring Absalom back. And David is like, "Now just tell me one thing. Did Joab get you to come here and tell me this story?" And he did. But David then starts at least the process of bringing Absalom home. But what I want to leave us with in this study is that idea about what she says about God. You want to know a good picture of the God of the Bible so far? God is a God who figures out ways to bring the banished home. Those who have been banished in exile, like Absalom in the story, but like humanity from the garden, God is a God who figures out ways to bring the outcast and the banished home.